Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years, Harris Ranch Resort, providing Western hospitality and award-winning cuisine, The Wonderful Company, committed to growing a better world, Comcast, connecting people to the moments and experiences that matter most, Producers Dairy, nourishing one life at a time, and Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Cook Land Company and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zante.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. I'm Blake Zante, Executive Director of the Maddy Institute and host of the Maddy Report. Today we'll be diving into the political views of young Californians, analyzing what they look like, and dissecting their impacts on politics and policy. Recently, the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC, published a report on the political views of young Californians. Joining us today to help explain this report is Eric McGhee, Policy Director and Senior Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Eric, welcome to the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, so before we get into what partisanship in California looks like right now, could you just give us a brief history of the evolution and characteristics of political views and behaviors in the state over the past few decades?
Yeah, well, so it's common to think today that California is a very blue state, a very liberal state, and I think it is. But of course, it wasn't always that way. And as recently as maybe the 1970s or 1980s, California was, it was kind of a toss-up state. It was could potentially flip either way. We had a Democratic legislature and sometimes Democratic governors. And we almost always voted for a Republican for president. So we were really a toss-up state, something more akin to, a Colorado or a Wisconsin or something today. And just gradually over time, we shifted. The shift really began in earnest in the 1980s and the 1990s. And eventually we came to where we are today, but it was a long path, and we weren't always the liberal bastion that we seem to be today.
So your data in this study that we're going to talk a lot about today on the program comes from the PPIC statewide survey and a few other studies. So could you just tell us, maybe walk us through the methodology and some of the sources that were used to collect this data?
Yeah, so the two main sources that we use are, number one, and primarily, our own statewide survey, which has been conducted multiple times every year. It's a survey of just California. It's been conducted multiple times every year for the last 25 years or so, 26 years. So it has a long history. We've got a long range of data over a long period of time that we can use to explore some of these questions. Then, as a way of comparing to what's going on nationally, trying to put California in that broader context, we turn to the Cooperative Elections Study, which is a really huge academic survey that is done around every election and has a large enough sample size, interviews enough people that we can compare the numbers from that survey in California to numbers in the rest of the country. So that is a nice benefit and gives us a nice comparison. They don't have exactly the same questions in both surveys, but they have questions that are reasonably comparable to each other.
So kind of in talking about, breaking down the data, how in this study did you look at and define the different age groups and categories that you looked at?
Yeah, so we have basically 3 age groups that we use. The first is 18 to 34. That's our youngest age group. Then we have an age group for most of our analysis, we just have 2 age groups, which is 18 to 34 and then 35 plus. For some of our analysis, we break that larger age group, that higher age group, into 35 to 54 and 55 plus. But for most of our analysis, we just have the 2 categories. And we chose those categories. I mean, it's not perfect. There's no perfect dividing line about when somebody is no longer a young person versus an old person. But mid-30s is about the time that most people settle down. They either decide to have kids or not. They decide to have a long-term partnership or not. They often will purchase a home by that point, if they're going to do it. So a lot of transitions happen around that time. And if we pick that dividing line, it allows us to say something about the difference between young and older that puts a lot of respondents from the survey in each of those groups, so we can say something with statistical confidence. So we do try to, as I say, we can maybe get into this a little bit further in the conversation, but we do explore those different dividing lines and see how it affects our results. But for most of the analysis, we just have this two category division.
And certainly we want to dive into what that data says and looking at those categories. This is the Maddy Report. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. We're talking with Eric McGhee, Policy Director and Senior Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, about the political views of young Californians. So Eric, in general, what perspective do younger people tend to hold with regard to policy issues such as, government intervention, diversity, housing, environmental regulation, and how do these perspectives compare to those held by older adults, would you say?
So by and large, young people hold more kind of traditionally liberal views. So that means on questions of, the government's role in society and the economy, they tend to favor a more kind of interventionist role where the government is doing more things and imposing more regulations. When it comes to questions of diversity and racial justice, they tend to take the position that more needs to be done to improve race relations. They tend to take a more favorable view toward immigrants and immigration. They tend to take a more favorable view toward more environmental regulations. So they just are kind of more traditionally liberal across the board. There's certainly some issues where they have the gaps are a little bit smaller, and some where the gaps are a little bit bigger. Interestingly, they tend to be a little bit smaller on a question like abortion. They tend to be, if you ask people, do you think your taxes are fair? There's not much difference between older people and younger people. Everybody thinks their taxes are not fair. So there is some variation, but by and large, the young people take the more liberal view and older people take the more conservative view.
And then looking at those age gaps, what about racial and ethnic differences across these generations? Is there any factors with those as well?
Yeah, that's a good question, because certainly young people in California are much more racially and ethnically diverse than older people. That's one of the biggest differences demographically that we see between these two groups. And so you might think, well, okay, if there's that kind of difference, maybe these age differences are explained by the fact that younger people are more diverse and people of color are more likely to take more liberal views. And certainly people of color are more likely to take more liberal views on average than are white Californians, but that doesn't really explain the gaps that we see. So often the age gap between young and old white Californians is even larger than the gap between young and old people of color in California. So it's really not about while some of the patterns are what you might expect, it doesn't really explain the age gaps that we see. They're broader than that.
So something on everyone's minds right now is the presidential election, and there's such a big partisan divide in the country. And something in your report you found was that the partisan divide was actually smaller among younger Californians across several different topics. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Why is that?
Well, yeah, that's one of the most fascinating things about what we found is that there are partisan gaps among young people. They're quite large. So I don't want to say that there aren't partisan differences. And Republicans among the young take much more conservative views on average than Democrats do, and the independents are somewhere in the middle. So it's a standard sort of thing for young people, but the size of the difference is much smaller across a range of different issues. We especially see it on these questions of racial justice and diversity and immigration. But we also see it to a certain extent on questions of government intervention in the economy, which is interesting because, normally we think of, okay, if you're going to identify yourself as a Republican, it's some of the defining issues about being a Republican are about, government sort of staying out of the economy. And some of what defines being a Democrat is supporting more government intervention in the economy. But we actually do see that those gaps are smaller. They on the issue positions, it tends to be that young Republicans on average take more liberal views than older Republicans do. And the differences between Democrats are not as significant.
We only have a few seconds left, but I just want to talk a little bit about the broader political views held by Californians across different age groups. So, are there any, in the last few seconds here, before we have to go to a break, any big differences that stood out, maybe in a sentence or two, on how Californians assign themselves politically?
So young people are much more likely to be Democratic and much less likely to be Republican, much more likely to say that they're liberal than conservative. Those are the big differences that we see across those broad issues. When we ask about sort of broader views of candidates, like, are candidates good candidates? Do I like the candidates that I see? There aren't many differences in those kinds of things.
Great, thank you. We're going to go to a quick break. This is the Maddy Report. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking about the political views of young Californians. Getting back into PPIC's report, the report also compared California's age gaps with those throughout the rest of the country. So what were some of your findings when you were looking at those gaps, from California compared to other states throughout the country?
Yeah, so what we found is that the same gaps exist elsewhere in the country. Everybody in California, so young and old, is more liberal on average than the rest of the country. So that holds up with kind of our sense of where California is politically. But the gaps between young and old are about the same size, and if anything, they tend to be larger in the rest of the country than they are in California. So it's not that this age difference is a uniquely California thing. It's really something that we see everywhere, even though California overall is a more liberal state.
And does that hold up as well with broader political issues? I mean, do those age gaps in California also kind of compare in the same way to the rest of the country?
Yeah, so you see in the rest of the country that young people are less likely to be Republican, more likely to be Democratic, less likely to be conservative, more likely to be liberal. The differences there tend to be more comparable, and we don't see the sort of the larger difference in the rest of the country compared to California like we do with the issues. But the basic pattern is the same. So young people are more liberal and older people are more conservative, and that's true in and outside California.
Now, once again, we're in an election year. It's really interesting to kind of break these things down of approval ratings. And so I'm curious, did you find anything about presidential and gubernatorial approval differing among younger and older voters? I mean, how did they, and was that based on any one political figure currently, or was that more generally measured in your report?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things is we actually see those partisan gaps that we discussed earlier, how the partisan differences are smaller among young people. We see the same smaller difference for approval. So young Republicans tend to be more approving of Democratic politicians and less approving of Republican politicians, and Democratic young people tend to be less approving of Democratic politicians and more approving of Republican politicians. So there's a shrinking of that distinction between young and old, of those partisan differences, and of course, as people have been discussing ad nauseum this election cycle, Democrats are not as approving. Young Democrats are not as approving of Joe Biden as older Democrats are. But at the same time, younger Republicans are more approving of Joe Biden than older Republicans are. So we just see, again, that the partisan polarization that has been such a defining characteristic of recent politics in the United States is just really not as acute among young people as among older people.
And do you think that those trends that you just spoke about are going to be, are we going to see those reflected in the election in November? I mean, what's your prediction there?
That's a good question. I mean, we definitely do see that these carry over to how people have chosen to vote. So the choices that Democrats and Republicans make who are young are a little bit different and not quite as divided as the choices that older Democrats and Republicans make. So we might expect that to carry over to some extent into the fall, and it'll just remain to be seen how much, to what extent.
This is the Maddy Report. We'll be right back talking about PPIC's report on young Californians. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. We're talking with Eric McGhee at the Public Policy Institute of California. Eric, one of the goals of your report was really to explore the future consequences of current trends for politics going forward. And we talked a little bit about this in the last segment before the break, but were you able to reach a clear conclusion in this regard? I mean, what was really the conclusion of the report?
Well, so yeah, one of the key questions that comes up with these age differences is this telling us something about the future, right? And that was actually what got us interested in this topic in the first place. Can we have some sense of where the state is headed by looking at today's young people, because the young people are the future of the state. Now, when you make those kinds of predictions, you always have to take into consideration that the differences that we're seeing today by age are just reflecting age. They're not reflecting generations, right? So it may just be that as people get older, the young people start to look like the older people, and we don't see anything change at all, right? And there are a lot of reasons why you might expect that people would become more conservative, in particular as they grow older. That's certainly an old saw about life. So we looked at that. We have enough data where we can go back many decades and see how within each generation have people changed as they've gotten older. Have they become more conservative? And the interesting thing we found was within California, we just didn't see that happening. We saw pretty consistent views within these generations over time. If there was any shifts, they happened kind of across all generations and not just one or two. We just didn't see the kind of becoming conservative as you got older that we might expect. The interesting flip side of that is that when we looked at this, the national data, we did see that kind of a trend in the national data. So we did see that as people got older, they became certainly more Republican, somewhat more conservative, but definitely more Republican, really across all of the generations. So there's a little bit of a mixed bag. It raises some questions as to why California is different. It might just be that California is different. It might be that Californians who are conservative or Republican are moving out of the state, and people who are more liberal or Democratic are moving into the state, and that means that we don't see the kind of change over time because we're sort of changing the membership of each generation as they get older and time passes. But it certainly left us feeling that we can't confidently say that anything about these trends, about these differences, is going to change in the near future. And so at least in that near future, we would expect that the differences that we're seeing now will start to become the reality of the California electorate as these young people age and become a larger share of that electorate.
Certainly, and there are a lot of variables, like you mentioned, to look at over time, which makes this particularly interesting. I mean, for further analysis, you kind of decided to break the groups of aging Californians, into an older age group and a more middle-aged group. What did you find that there was any significant change when you broke up aging Californians into these different groups, or what did you find there?
Yeah, so we did break them into sort of a 55 plus, kind of on the verge of retirement or in retirement age group, and then kind of a more of a middle-aged age group. And when we made that distinction between those two older Californians, the differences were not that significant. So the biggest differences were really between the youngest Californians and the older Californians. There were some issues where the differences were a little bit larger. So on these questions of racial justice and immigration, the gaps are larger among those older Californians, so the middle-aged Californians tend to take a more liberal view than the oldest Californians do. And, there's generally the oldest Californians are a little bit more conservative on most issues, but it's not a very big difference. Not certainly enough that it would, make us reconsider the rest of the conclusions from the report and the rest of our expectations about where things are going to be headed in the next few years. You might think if the oldest Californians are really different, then we might see a faster pace of change. But except for, again, a couple of those issues like racial diversity and immigration, we didn't see a lot of that.
And so based on the PPIC statewide survey data that from the past 20 years, you were able to gain some insight into how views on political issues might change as people grow older. And you've talked a little bit about this, but do you have any final conclusions as we wrap up the show today on just, what are the overarching things that people should take away from the report moving forward, and what should policymakers take away as well in California?
Yeah, I think first of all, it seems like, at least in the near-term future, that we should expect politics to become somewhat less polarized. And in California, and probably in the rest of the nation as well, a little bit more liberal. Exactly how much is not going to be clear, but probably we're going to see a little bit of a trend in that direction. This also really raises questions about, how should the parties and politicians, elected officials, how should they relate to young voters? There's some interesting kind of conundrums here. Like we have young people who identify themselves as Democratic or Republican, but seem to take different views on the issues. So what does it mean to be Democratic or Republican for these younger Californians? This is something that really should be explored more. How should elected officials and parties respond to the differences in opinions that we're seeing among these younger generations? Maybe it's a matter of explaining an existing policy position differently or better. Maybe it's a matter of changing the policy positions to sort of match where those young voters are. But some kind of reckoning is going to have to occur to deal with the really sometimes large differences that we see between young Californians and older Californians.
And unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But Eric McGhee with the Public Policy Institute of California, thank you for joining us on the program today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for joining the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, visit maddyinstitute.com. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.com.